Hey everybody, Chris Kresser here. I hope this podcast and my blog and books have been helpful resources for you and will continue to be. But if you've been struggling with a chronic health problem and are feeling stuck, consider coming to work with my team and me at the California Center for Functional Medicine. We work with patients all over the U.S. and have experience treating a wide range of conditions, including GI problems, autoimmunity, hypothyroidism, cognitive mood and behavioral issues, weight gain and metabolic dysfunction, and more. Our unique model teams clinicians with nurse practitioners and health coaches, all of whom are trained in my ADAPT framework approach to provide a high level of care to our patients. This means more support between appointments, personalized guidance on diet, lifestyle, and behavior change, a cutting-edge patient portal with 24/7 access to your labs and records, handouts and resources to guide your protocols, and a team of practitioners working together on your case. We're currently accepting new patients, so if you'd like to learn more, visit chriskresser.com/become-a-patient. Hey everybody, it's Chris Kresser. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. Really excited about the interview this week. I'm going to be talking with Dr. Joe Mercola. Dr. Mercola is trained as a board-certified family physician and treated over 10,000 patients before transitioning to focusing full-time on his website 22 years ago. It has been the most visited natural health site on the web for the last 15 years. He's had many best-selling books, but his latest book on keto, Fat for Fuel, was the #1 book sold in the US when it was launched in May of 2017. Now, Dr. Mercola has a new book out called Keto Fast, and I'm really looking forward to talking with him about it because when I read it, he sent me an advanced review copy. I was pleased to see that his approach to ketogenic diet and intermittent fasting and fasting is very similar to my own and what I've arrived at through my own experimentation and also through working with hundreds of patients in this combination of keto and fasting. And he has a lot of the same concerns that I do regarding ongoing ketogenic dieting in many people and in extended water fasting in many people. And I really love the way that he's put it together into a cyclical approach with cycles of intermittent fasting and ketosis, and I think a safer and more tolerable way of getting the benefits of fasting without doing extended water fasting. So hope you enjoy this as much as I did. Let's dive in. Dr. Joe Mercola, thank you so much for being here. I've been looking forward to this for some time.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be with you. And I want to, before we begin, thank you so much for representing our views on Joe Rogan and really helping the world understand the truth about natural medicine.
Oh, thank you for that. It was arduous, but hopefully worth it. So I'm excited to talk about fasting, ketogenic diet, and in particular, the approach you've outlined in your most recent book. And before we do that, I would love to just hear, what took you down this road personally? How did you get interested originally in ketogenic diets and fasting, and then how did you arrive where you are now?
Well, I was motivated to start keto because of the buzz about it a few years ago, and I wrote a book, Fat for Fuel, several years ago, which actually the week it was launched was the #1 selling book in the entire country.
Awesome. By
the Nielsen rating. So I was convinced of the value of that approach metabolically and experienced some side effects from starting it myself and learned by trial and error. I learned there's some things that you should not do. And then I became to appreciate that fasting, complete multi-day water fasting, typically 5 days or so, was one of the most powerful metabolic interventions I'd ever seen and witnessed clinically. And of course, historically, it's been used for thousands of years, and virtually every major religion on the planet integrates it into their approach. So it seemed to make sense. But then, so I wanted to follow up on my book, Fat for Fuel. I was going to combine that with multi-day water fasting, and then that was the intention of the book. Mm-hmm. And when I started to research it, I realized that I was wrong. So I modified it significantly to obtain the most amount of benefit you can with the least amount of work.
Right.
Yeah, which is
and potential downsides, which we'll talk about.
Yeah.
because that's definitely been my experience as a clinician too. It's really interesting that when you look at the research on fasting, it's like a miracle cure. You can find studies for fasting for just about every chronic disease, and from severe autoimmune diseases to cancer to any inflammatory condition. But of course, fasting, we can't do it forever.
No, you can't. but the more frequently you can, the better benefits you get.
Right.
And let me just interrupt by saying that there's one benefit that I neglected to mention in the book, but I realized after writing it is that the fasting benefits on your sleep are extraordinary. Do you wear an Oura ring at all? Or?
I do, yeah.
All right. So then that when the days that you're fasting, oh my gosh, your readiness score goes through the roof.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible that all that tissue repair, which I definitely want to do a deeper dive into that. But you have a section in your book on the history of fasting, which I think is interesting because it's been around for a really long time. You could say it's maybe one of the original health interventions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There's no question. It's been used for thousands of years. I mean, we've got Plato and Hippocrates promoting it, 2,000 years ago. It started in the U.S. about the 1800s with the natural hygiene movement.
Right.
It didn't really become popular until Herbert Shelton started popularizing it in 1911, about 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. And today we've got Alan Goldhammer out in your neck of the woods in the True North Clinic in Northern California, who that have fasted more people than anywhere in North America, at 16,000 people from anywhere from 5 to 40 days.
Yeah. And there's, a lot of other benefits too, of course. I think for me personally, just looking at my relationship with food, which fasting illuminates, and not cooking and cleaning, I have to say. I appreciate that a lot on a day when I'm busy, and, allows me, I love food probably as much as anybody I know, and cooking and food preparation. I'm a total foodie, but I have to say that occasionally I just get tired of the whole process. And I'm
actually surprised to hear that. I thought you'd be a little more oblivious to it. You'd be one of the people you live to live, but
no, I love food. I mean, I cook all the time. I love going to farmers markets. I'm a total foodie, but there are times where I need a break from it. And I love what fasting does for that too. So let's talk a little bit about some of the mechanisms of fasting. I've touched on this in previous shows, but you do a pretty deep dive in that in your book. So you talk about autophagy, of course, and several others. And there's been a lot of focus on stem cells and other ways of addressing stem cells, which maybe are not quite as safe or as well proven at this point. So why would we consider fasting in terms of, the cellular benefits?
Sure. Well, I think one of the most important ones is the issue with the sleep, which I just mentioned. So sleep is close to, if not nearly as important as getting the food right.
Yeah.
And many people don't appreciate that.
Yeah.
So I'm sure, you're not one of them, I know, but a lot of people don't. I certainly didn't until I read Matthew Walker's book. And he just did a good interview, 2-hour interview with Rhonda Patrick on her podcast about it. But it's powerful. But getting back to autophagy, and I'm sure almost everyone listening to this has heard it before, but let me just summarize it because some maybe have not heard it previously. So it's, in my viewpoint, the primary reason why you want to fast. And what does is to activate autophagy. And what does autophagy mean? It means that your body essentially identifies defective and dysfunctional cellular parts, not whole cells, because the process for that is called apoptosis. But these cellular parts, these organelles, it targets them, and then the lysosomes latch onto them, and they release these digestive enzymes to break it down to its constituent elements, amino acids and fatty acids, and then it recycles them into new parts. And that's the other benefit, is that you get regeneration, which is what you get after you fast. So there's the magic of fasting really, certainly there's some of the experiences you mentioned, you say the time, effort, and energy, your mental clarity improves, but the primary benefit is when you refeed and you give your body the raw materials to rebuild new cellular parts.
I don't think that's well understood, actually. And I think I really loved how clear you made that in your book. And especially when it comes to refeeding, which we'll talk about earlier, is one of the ways of addressing the potential downsides of fasting and doing it cyclically. That I don't think it's well understood that some of the main benefits you get from fasting occur only when you start eating again.
That's right. And that's one of many reasons why I don't recommend long fast, because you don't get as many cycles in there.
Right.
And in addition to when you're fasting, as I mentioned with the sleep, your readiness score goes through the roof. What does that mean? That means you're able to really work out hard and you have the energy to do it. Mm-hmm. And so I do this keto fasting twice a week. And the days I do it the days before I work out hard on my strength training.
Right.
So then I do that fasting, and then I go and have lots of protein, lots of carbs, and it just is a fabulous way to improve your metabolic health.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I want to get a lot more into the different ways to do it in a little bit, because I think that's where the magic happens. How you actually set it up and make it work and cycle it along with your training regimen, et cetera. But another thing I think we're both interested in terms of fasting is gut health. So I see a lot of patients who have SIBO and, all kinds of long-term GI issues. And maybe they've done several treatments for SIBO. They've taken rifaximin, and we've done botanical protocols and other strategies. And either it goes away for some time and comes back, or it never goes away at all. And I've become increasingly interested in fasting and ketogenic diet and cyclical keto and fasting as a tool for addressing these conditions. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, because, and I'm not sure that anyone understands exactly the mechanism, but more than likely it's a jumpstart to your microbiome health. It improves the diversity, and it helps repair some of the leaky gut issues where you have these essentially spaces within the membranes in the intestine where large molecules can leak through and cause major problems. So it really facilitates healing of that permeability through this brain-gut pathway, and enhances the integrity of your gut lining. So I like it for that purpose. It's sort of a side benefit. I don't look at it as one of the main benefits, but it's so many people suffer with this issue. So it's a really helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, we know from the research that the elemental diet, which I'm not recommending here, but it's the most effective treatment for SIBO. And I think what happens with the elemental diet is even more powerful with fasting. You're starving the bacteria that are overgrown in the small intestine. If you're not giving them any food source, they can't proliferate. And it turns out more effective even than antibiotics. So I'm curious to do, we occasionally have been using Ubiome and other labs to do serial testing of the microbiome with interventions like this. So I had an idea when I was reading your book that maybe we'll put some patients on the Keto Fast approach and do some before and after testing with Ubiome and see what we can detect.
Yeah, please update me on that. That sounds like an interesting study.
Absolutely. All right. So we've talked a little bit about the history of fasting, the mechanisms of fasting, and why it works. What about safety and contraindications? Because you see, there's a lot of, I think, misleading claims made about fasting, like it's really dangerous. And on the other hand, I think there's also some irresponsible claims made about fasting and not enough attention in some ways about who shouldn't do it. So where do you come down on this?
Well, thank you for bringing that to everyone's attention, because sometimes it's something I failed to mention. But you are absolutely correct. Fasting is not for everyone. At least partial fasting. There's certainly multi-water day fasting, but that's a relatively small minority of people. And who are those people? People who are underweight, who don't have enough body mass, would obviously not want to fast. Or if you have an eating disorder, that would only exacerbate it. And then if someone's pregnant or even nursing. Yeah. So, that's not a large number of people. No. Probably far less than 5%. My guess, even less than 1% of the population.
Yeah. Yeah. Just good to know. I've had pregnant women nursing women ask me about fasting. So I always like to make that clear, because when you're pregnant or nursing, you're really trying to build up, and feed the growing baby. That's the priority there.
Yeah.
But of course,
anabolism is the key.
yes, absolutely.
And that's the beautiful thing about fasting is you cycle between anabolism and catabolism, and virtually no one's doing that. And I'm sure you're familiar with Sachin Panda's work, where 90% of people are eating more than 12 hours a day. And that isn't even sufficient for intermittent fasting.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like a constant grazing that's happening. The cyclical thing is really interesting to me, because I know you and I both really appreciate the ancestral perspective. And if you think about like what likely happened in a natural and evolutionary environment, people were not voluntarily fasting, but they had natural periods of food scarcity. And then those periods of food scarcity were naturally followed by periods of food abundance after they killed an animal or something like that. So our bodies evolved in this environment of cyclical periods of food scarcity and food abundance. And it makes sense that our metabolic machinery would be adapted to work that way. So I love how this approach really mimics that.
Yeah, and sadly, Chris, I don't think there's many approaches that are replicating this pattern. It's just like it's an all or none component. You're doing keto all the time, or you don't do it. And maybe some people are doing cyclical keto, but the integration and the partial fasting is, I think, the missing key piece.
That's where we agree 100% on this too. I was so happy to see your book, because that's the approach I had naturally settled on in my clinic, because I had seen actually a lot of the downsides of 24/7 ketogenic dieting and excessive fasting. So I know that you experienced some of those yourself. You mentioned that. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about some of the downsides of ongoing keto.
Sure.
And ongoing, the dark sides of water fasting.
Well, they're two separate issues, but because if you're doing keto continuously, as some people advocate, I think most people are going to run into problems, primarily with their hormone systems and specifically your thyroid. You develop some thyroid resistance, but then you're really in this constant catabolic phase where you're just breaking down your body, and that's good, but you need to build it up.
Right.
And, and the common belief in it certainly was what I understood when I first started, that this was like the diet you should be on forever. And I learned really quickly it's a bad idea, because after a few months, you start losing muscle mass, which is not a good strategy, especially as you're aging, and sarcopenia just kicks in almost relentlessly.
Yeah.
So, that's the primary component. And then that regeneration component, the feasting part, is missing.
Yeah.
And that is the massive, almost magical benefits you get by integrating that in a cyclical fashion.
Yeah, I've also seen, even with people who had phenomenal results with keto for weight loss initially, that they get a plateau or even start to move back in the other direction. And it's been in some ways challenging for me my approach with them was usually to actually have them start eating more carbohydrate, which seemed counterintuitive to them because they had such great results, from doing keto initially, but that can often kickstart the weight loss process again. And I think you've explained why in the book, in terms of how all of those mechanisms that get engaged when you start the refeeding process.
Right.
And then what about, water fasting? This is a powerful strategy. It's something that's got a lot of history behind it, but what are some of the downsides there?
Well, one of the primary downsides is that it made a lot of sense historically, and that's why it was done for thousands of years, and is still done. But we live in a different century, the 21st century, that didn't exist previously, obviously. And one of the major contributions within the last 100 years is that we've had the chemical industry make loads of tens of thousands of different chemicals. And most of these chemicals are fat soluble. And being fat soluble, they tend to wind up being stored, not metabolized, but stored in your fat cells. So when you do this multi-day water fasting, especially without eating any food, you're doing two things. One is you're liberating the toxins, and most people, and I know you have great experience with this, are not metabolically healthy enough to metabolize those toxins. Yeah. And as a result, they have the side effects. Because almost everyone's aware of people who are water fasting, they feel miserable. Right. It's largely, I believe, as a result of these liberated toxins that are not properly metabolized and excreted. So that's one. The other, as a clinician, you're deeply aware of this too, is compliance.
Yeah.
The compliance for this in the general population is well under 1%. You're going to have to almost kill someone before they're going to want multi-day water fasting.
It's true.
It's just a pragmatic approach.
Yeah.
So those are the two big ones. But another practical one is that if you're going to do a multi-day water fasting, I mean, unless you're massively overweight, and there's some people who have lost 300-400 pounds on doing that, you're only going to be able to do it a few times a year. Initially, you might be able to do it 5, 6, 7 times the first year, but after that, probably not more than once a quarter, which means you're only going to cycle in and out and get these the refeed benefits like 5 times a year, which is like virtually clinically insignificant. So yeah, you'll get some really great benefit when you refeed, but you have to refeed differently when you haven't been eating for a few days. But if you're doing the keto fast, you can do that 100 times a year.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing if you're doing it twice a week. Yeah, that's pretty amazing. So let's go into this now, and why don't you define keto fasting for everybody, and then we'll kind of get into some of the nitty-gritty details about how you sequence it with your exercise routines and also how you transition into it. Because I like how you provided a kind of on-ramp for people who've never, who don't have experience with this, so that they're avoiding some of the potential downsides if they just start whole hog.
Yeah, I don't think you can start whole hog, and you have to be metabolically flexible. Your body has to have the capacity to burn fat as a primary fuel, and over 80% of the people in this country, as you're well aware of, are insulin resistant, and these people cannot do keto fasting initially. They have to transition into it through a program of doing calorie restriction. And my favorite, of course, is intermittent fasting. So, and it's not just a 12-hour, because I don't think virtually any benefits occur at 12 hours. It probably starts at 14, but I think you're going to get most of the benefits from 16 to 18 hours of a window where you're not eating. So otherwise eating within a 6 to 8 hour window a day, which is the exact opposite of what most people eat. they're not eating 6 to 8 hours.
Yeah, for sure. And during that intermittent fast period, there are a lot of different ways that are recommended to do this. Some recommend just, water and non-caloric beverages only, like black coffee or black teas. Others say it's okay to eat, to have a little bit of fat in the coffee or tea during the intermittent fast period. Where do you land on that? I'd
like to go with the no calories, because I really want to try to get as much benefit from autophagy, and certainly most calories will tend to inhibit autophagy. But in the transition period, the initial 4-week phase that I recommend that everyone do, and unless they've been doing it, like you could start this thing this week because you're doing it. Yeah. But if you haven't done that, then you need to essentially work up to the point where you're only eating within 6 to 8 hours, and then do that for 4 straight weeks. Now, during that transition phase, I think it's okay to have a little food and snacks, especially the coconut oil or MCT oil, if you're feeling fatigued, because your body needs to become metabolically flexible, and you aren't yet. So you're going to need some fuel source, and those types of fats will rapidly be absorbed and converted to energy, so you'll feel better. But once you're doing it, then I don't think it's wise to, at least from my perspective.
Right. So you compress your eating window to 6 to 8 hours for 1 month, and that's no calories during that period, unless you need a transition period where you're having maybe a little bit of fat during that time. And then what? What's step 2?
Well, this is what I've learned from trial and error. So let's say you have a 6-hour eating window. So your first meal is at 9 a.m. in the morning. Your last meal is at 3.
3, yeah.
So the one caveat in that intermittent feeding window is to make sure that your last meal is at least 3 hours before bedtime, which can be a social challenge for many people, but I think metabolically that's what your goal is. And if you do eat a meal in that time, make it really, really light.
Right.
You do not want a lot of energy when you're sleeping. That is an unwise time to load your body with fuel. So your last meal was at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You come around to eat breakfast a day at 9, which would be the normal day, the time that you would eat. So instead of eating your regular meal, you only have like one meal. And that meal is about it's anywhere from 300 to 500 calories. Essentially, you take your lean body mass and you multiply times 3.5, and then you come up with the calories. So, and that's your meal for the day, and you don't eat anything else for 24 more hours. So essentially, you're doing a partial fast of 42 hours on, say, 500 calories. And that is the magic. And I'll refine the details in a moment, but because I've been intermittently fasting for 6 hours for years now, and I don't lose weight when I intermittent fast, assuming that I'm eating my appropriate amount of calories.
Right.
But the moment I do a partial fast, I'll lose anywhere from 3 to 5 pounds. Yeah, the next day, which is a good thing. Most of it's water, of course. It's not lean body mass, it's water. But still lose. You don't lose that weight when you're intermittently fasting.
Right.
So that's a strong suggestion that there's something very significant going on clinically when you do this.
Okay, so that's your keto fast day. So you've been intermittent fasting for a while. You're fat adapted, and you add a keto fast day. You're eating between 300 and 600 calories, depending on your lean body mass. And you go through this very clearly in the book. There's a great chart actually that takes you through this, which I found to be very helpful.
Well, let me be specific on what that food is, though.
Yeah.
We've actually have an accompanying Keto Fast cookbook, where you can actually create meals that are designed to do this. Yeah. But what I do to simplify it is, and I've actually modified it somewhat since the book was published, is that 50% of those calories, I believe, should be protein. Because that's going to fuel your detoxification system. So anywhere from 20 to 50 grams or so. But here's the key okay, let me finish this off. So you got protein, but you maybe have certainly less than 20 grams of carbs, ideally less than 10, and the same amount of fat. So relatively small amount of fat and carbs and protein. But it's a very specific type of protein. This is not a hamburger. This is not really even meat. This is plant-based protein for the most part, except the exception would be collagen, which is very, very low in branched chain amino acids, which will stimulate mTOR, which is the last thing you want to have when you're trying to activate autophagy, because those branched chains will activate mTOR and inhibit autophagy. So collagen has virtually none of the branched chains, and plant-based proteins, like we've got a vegan-based protein powder that I absolutely love. So I have that, some collagen and some chlorella to make up those protein on those days.
Okay, so you're eating a certain amount of protein, you're keeping the carbs under 20 grams or even 10, and then the remainder of whatever your calorie is between 300 to 600 would be fat.
Yes.
Okay, so then you do that, and then is your refeed day the next day?
It is the next day, but there's one more caution, because most people are taking supplements. And many people have identified themselves as having an MTHR genetic SNP. Yeah. So they're taking methylfolate or methyl B12. So on the day that you're keto fasting is the day that you do not take methylfolate, do not take methyl B12. And why is because those are pretty much anabolic supplements. These are supplements that pregnant women take to build their baby. So the last thing you want to do is stimulate anabolism. You want to stimulate catabolism. So don't take any methyl B12 or methylfolate, or colostrum would also do something similar, or even ketone supplements, right? Like ketone esters, because what happens, it's really interesting. The ketones essentially break down to butyric acid or butyrate, and the butyrate will actually increase acetyl coenzyme A, which also inhibits autophagy. So just let your body make its own ketones. You don't take any extras.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got those cautions for the fast day, and then how do you approach the refeed day?
Oh, the refeed day is the feast day.
It's a fun day, yeah.
There's not too many limits on it. You just have, other than high quality foods, but I would go crazy with the branched chains. That's the days I have the whey protein. I have lots of whey protein. That's the day that I think strength training, that is the day that you really push it very hard, stress your body, because your sleep is going to be through the roof. It's going to be unbelievable. And you'll be able to work out very hard. So then you have lots of good protein, maybe 25, 50% more than you normally have. And you give your body the fuel to rebuild your tissues. Oh, the other benefit of that happens is that during the partial fast, you're going to activate the stem cells. I know you mentioned it in the intro, but we kind of slid past that. And there's a lot of people nowadays who are advocating stem cells, whether autologous or otherwise. And first of all, it's very pricey. I mean, a minimum is $5,000, but more likely 10 or 20,000. And I'm sure some people get benefits, but there's no question there's a cost to it. And there's some concern about the safety of these things too. But I think it's a far better approach to use your own cells and activate them, which clearly keto fasting will help activate.
Absolutely. And for you said maybe double your typical protein intake. You're still eating this during your 6 to 8 hour window.
Yes, there's no change there.
Just to clarify. And then what about carbohydrate ranges for people?
Yeah, I think that I wouldn't go a lot more than 150 grams of carbs, but those are the days when you have a lot of carbohydrates. There's no question about it.
And 150 is going to feel a lot more than 10 the previous day. That's going to feel like a feast, like you said. It's going to be
it is an absolute feast. In fact, most of my days, I feel like I've had a Thanksgiving. I'm stuffed to the max. I'm eating somewhere about between 4,000 and 4,500 calories.
Right. Okay. So we're sequencing this. You've got your intermittent fast day, you got your keto fast day, then you got follow that by a refeed day. And I know from your book and just talking to you, you're doing 2 keto fast days a week. So you recommend between 1 or 2, depending on the goals and what's going on for that person.
Yeah, and sometimes I'm not able to do that because I'm traveling, and when I'm traveling, I don't have the luxury of maintaining my weight, because if my weight is below a certain threshold, I will not do a keto fast day because I'll lose too much weight.
Yeah.
So,
and what is that threshold for you in terms of, you mentioned low lean body mass as a contraindication for fasting.
For me, it's, I think I'm under 10% body fat, and I like my basal weight is, I don't like to go below 175. I'm trying to get to 185, and I'm getting closer, and I've gotten closer there since I've started increasing the protein on the partial fasting days.
Yeah.
So
just so everyone knows, you're a tall guy. I was surprised when I met you because I'm tall. I didn't know you were as tall as you are. So 175 is pretty lean for someone your height.
Yeah, so I'd like to put on a little muscle mass. This year I turned 65, so sarcopenia becomes an issue. 50% of people who are 80 years old have lost most of their muscle mass. Yeah. So you've got to be aggressive and prevent that inevitability.
It's super important for healthy aging. I learned that a while ago, and I think it doesn't get enough attention, which of course is why strength training is so important as you age as well.
And interestingly, and Jason Fung addressed this in his most recent book, The Longevity Plan, I think. I'm not sure the exact title, but it's his most recent book, that your needs and requirements for protein increase as you age. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's a little counterintuitive.
Kind of backwards for most people. And a lot of people develop, low stomach acid and GERD, and so they can't tolerate as much protein when they age, and then they end up eating less, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we got 2, if you're doing the full approach and you're doing 2 keto fast days a week, then you're doing 2 refeed days a week. So then that leaves 3 days of just the intermittent fast compressed food intake, right?
Yeah, and whatever normal calories that work for you in ranges. So, I go over that in my previous book, Fat for Fuel. And another interesting tool that many people may be unaware of is Cronometer.com. That's Cronometer. And I don't think any expert would disagree. That's probably the finest nutrient tracker out there. It's basically free if you use it on the desktop. And we actually have if you put a /Mercola, you get one that's specifically designed for keto fasting. So it's a really good tool. Have you used it before, Chris?
We use it all the time with our patients. There are certain nutrients, as you know, that you can't really measure very accurately in any body fluid, like calcium. So we'll often have people track their nutrient intake with this and get a sense of where they're falling short in their diet. And what you learn is, in many cases, people are not getting enough nutrients, even when they're on I'm doing kind of air quotes here, healthy diet. So it's a really super important tool. And you can, I love the way you've set it up. You put your body type in there and your conditions and what you're trying to do, and then it can give you the actual what you're shooting for with keto fast.
Yeah, it's a really elegant system. I'm so delighted that Aaron was open to modifying. He initially designed the site for longevity because he's that life extension is one of his primary goals, and it just happens to work out really well for this. Now, life extension is one of my goals, which is one of the reasons I wrote this book, because I would love to live beyond 120, which is not really physiologically possible at this point in time. So the strategy that most of us are using is stay as healthy as you can, which has a lot of other benefits until there's some changes in the technology, which might allow us to jump past the physical barrier.
Yeah, absolutely. And with the way things are going, it's not at all inconceivable that could happen. So let's kind of talk about some tips and tricks, so to speak, to make this work. So let's say someone's relatively new to fasting and they're really struggling with appetite cravings, during their periods of either the intermittent fasting or on the keto fast day. What do you suggest there?
Well, that's the beauty of intermittent fasting. At least after you've done it for a while and your body's developed the metabolic flexibility to access your fat stores, break them down, and create energy out of them. So initially, if you're part of the 80% of the population who is insulin resistant, you're not able to do that or do that well, then you're going to have cravings. That is normal. That's natural. That's exactly what you'd predict and expect, because your glucose levels have dropped and you need energy to burn. You can't burn the stored fat that you have in your body. It's just inaccessible to you as an energy source. So what you have to sort of struggle through it. And for most people, it's typically not longer than 2 or 3 weeks, unless you're really metabolically damaged. And in that case, it may take a few months. But in that process, you can, as I think mentioned earlier, you can have some healthy fats like coconut oil, which is probably the least expensive. And even better would be MCT oil. And even better than that would be caprylic acid, or C8, which is a subtype of MCT oil. It's just a little bit more expensive. But the benefit of these is they all convert to eventually ketones, or fatty acids that are A, easily digested, so you don't need to take enzymes with them, and then B, rapidly converted to energy and can give you that missing energy you need until your body's able to make that transition. So once you've achieved that flexibility, though, which I said for most people, it's going to be within that month that you're doing the intermittent fasting, then you'll know you just aren't hungry. And I'm sure you can testify to this, as can hundreds, if not thousands, of your patients who've made this transition. Hunger is not an issue. Yeah, it's actually the opposite. In my experience and in experience of many of my patients, is when that ketone production starts, you get less hungry, and you can actually go for longer periods without feeling those cravings, even than when you're eating food, which is really, again, counterintuitive for most people. But that's I've had so many people say that, and that's been my experience too. Yes, it's just amazing. So now that doesn't discount the fact that some people may have a psychological craving, not a physiological, but a psychological. And they just, want something in their mouth, want to chew on something.
Absolutely.
So what I do, I have the good fortune of living in Florida. So I have like over 1,000 aloe plants. And every day I cut off like 2 or 3 leaves and I just suck on the gel. Right. That's just that. I think there's a lot of good health benefits aside from helping to address that issue, which I don't really need it for that issue. But it's kind of nice. It's just like you're chewing on something that essentially has no calories. Right. Yeah, absolutely. So another thing that we both are big believers in, which I sometimes think of, like, if we're thinking about health, optimizing health, also optimizing health span, not just lifespan, but health span. What are the biggest levers? Obviously a healthy, nutrient dense, real food diet. I think fasting and periods of ketosis are at the top of the list. And I would also put sauna at the top, and hot and cold, and possibly cycling between those two at the top of the list too. And I know you're a big believer in that too. So how do you use sauna how do you cycle sauna use into this protocol or this approach that you're doing? And tell us a little bit more about your approach there. Yeah, well, I'm absolutely on the same page as you. There's no question that I believe that the cyclical use of exposure to hot and cold will help improve your health. It's just pretty well. There's many studies that just strongly suggest that, certainly the Finns, but they use a traditional sauna, which is a little bit more challenging and not as readily available in the U.S. unless you go to one of these big institutions.
Right.
So, what most people are using in their home, because it's so much more convenient. And in the Finns, almost everyone has a sauna in their home. I mean, you can't, I don't think you can build a home in Finland without a sauna.
Pretty much. Yeah.
But it's miserably cold there most of the year.
Yeah.
So anyway, here in the U.S., we don't do that. So most people have resorted to using infrared saunas, and that was been the rage for a long time. There's some major problems with it, which I'd like to address. So they were initially started as the far infrared saunas, and almost all the initial units had really high EMFs, specifically the magnetic fields that were through the roof. So you'd be damaging yourself from a molecular perspective from exposure to these frequencies. But then there's other issues with that. And I was convinced that you could modulate the far infrared to be the best sauna, so much so that when I was at Bulletproof in 2017, there was an exhibitor there named Brian Richards who founded the company Sauna Space. And he seemed like a bright guy. So I wanted to have a discussion with him, wanted to be respectful, but my intention was to sort of decimate him with these arguments. And it turns out the exact opposite occurred, and he decimated me and he converted me to this understanding of the amazing benefits of near infrared saunas.
Yes.
And, one of the primary ones is that the sunlight, people don't understand it, but, 40% of the rays from sunlight radiation are infrared.
Yep.
And mostly near infrared. I mean, there's some far, but it's mostly near.
Mm-hmm.
So that would strongly suggest that regular exposure to these frequencies is probably a good idea.
Yeah. And just so you know, I have a Sauna Space, and Brian has been on the podcast. I have the EMF.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Free Sauna Space. So yeah, we're big believers in that as well.
Yeah, I love Brian. I did an interview with him too, and he's just, he absolutely converted me to this understanding. So I'm preaching to the choir with your
with the listeners. Yeah.
So I'll skip over that. Just listen to your previous.
No, it's great. I'm just curious. Like, how do you do any specific timing with the sauna?
Well, I was going to go further into the details of the difference between the far and the near, but Jimmy, let me just mention that you have the EMF free one.
I do, yeah.
Okay. So then that's the exact same one I use. It is, in my view, the best sauna on the market. It is not the most convenient sauna to use or practical, but it is the best from a health perspective, because it helps put your body into a parasympathetic mode because you're shielding all the frequencies coming out. The whole sauna is grounded, and you're just getting these healthy benefits, and it's putting your body in a state which it could benefit from to detoxify. So one of the, as I alluded to earlier, when you're doing the partial fasting, unlike intermittent fasting, even in intermittent fasting, you're going to stimulate autophagy to a degree, but a relatively minor degree compared to what you do with keto fasting. So the morning after your keto fast, you are really going to be excreting toxins. So one of the ways that you can help facilitate the excretion of those toxins through your sweat is through regular use of the near infrared sauna. Now, if you can't afford the $8,000, the EMF-free sauna space, and many people can't, and there's nothing wrong with that, then you can get a lesser expensive version. They sell them, Sauna Space does, of course, but you can even go and use Sauna Therapy purchase the book Sauna Therapy by Lawrence Wilson and make one yourself.
Absolutely.
Just be careful on choosing the materials wisely, because you are heating this thing up. And if you've got toxic materials in, though, you're going to be breathing them in, and you're sort of defeating the purpose of doing it.
Yeah. And just to clarify to the listeners, the basic Sauna Space unit, the bulbs are shielded from EMF. So they're in Faraday cages, and you're not getting EMF exposure from the bulbs. The difference with the full EMF protective units is that it's shielding EMF from outside of the sauna from coming in. And so it's got a liner around the whole sauna that keeps ambient EMF from coming in the sauna. So I just wanted to clarify that Brian's really good about, even with the basic sauna, that there's no EMF exposure from the bulbs themselves.
Yes, and part of the reason for that, and let me continue to improve the clarification, is that not only although is the shielding there, but it is all that shielding is grounded,
right,
which allows to dissipate the electrical fields that you're exposed to straight down to the ground. So you got to be careful about the grounding component too.
Absolutely. So just to put this all together, the week would look like you've got your intermittent fast day, a keto fast day. The next morning would be sauna use. And then that's going to be your hard strength training day. Yeah. And your refeed day.
Yeah. And let me tell you another benefit of happening, because I forgot to mention this. Not even sure if I put it in the book, but when you are partial fasting, your growth hormone increases by about 200 to 300%. Now you're going to say, that doesn't make sense. How does that happen? Because we know that growth hormone normally stimulates IGF-1. And when you have high GF-1, that is an absolute shutdown for autophagy. But what happens is that the liver becomes relatively, where many of these growth hormone receptors are, becomes resistant. The receptors to it become resistant. So you do get lower IGF-1 levels, but you still get the high growth hormone. So what you want to do on the days of the partial fast, before you eat your magical refeed feast, that's when you strength train. You do not eat food while you're strength training. Yeah. Do it fasting, and you'll radically improve the benefits.
Yeah, absolutely. Important clarification there, just for sequencing. So you've got your sauna or you exercise. I like to exercise before I use the sauna because I find that I sweat more readily, more quickly. Yeah. So if we're splitting hairs here, I'll typically...
No. Ideally, I in my case, I see a personal trainer and I go to his studio. Yeah. So it's pragmatically and practical for me to do that. Right. So I do a little bit of different exercises. I'll do body weight exercises and maybe go on my elliptical, but my strength training is after it.
Yeah, and we're talking about the last few percent here in terms of optimization. So you'll still get a huge benefit if you're not able to sequence it in the perfect way that we're talking about. But I know my listeners are really into, optimizing as much as possible. So I like to at least lay it out there. So then you do your refeed that day and you're feeling like $1 million. When you do the refeeds and even just the compressed 6 to 8 hour window in general, I know I get a lot of questions about this for patients. How do you approach it? Do you eat just a couple meals typically, or do you eat more than a couple meals during that period? What's your personal approach?
Well, it's not much different than my normal days, except I eat more food. Yeah. So instead of having 2 eggs in my salad, I have 3 eggs. Right. And instead of having vegan protein in my smoothie, I switch over to whey concentrate. Mm-hmm. So I have a lot more branched chain amino acids. I change the ratio of those things around. And, it's the sequencing and the timing, the cycling that is so important. It's so massively overlooked. If you don't understand, then you get the timing off, you're going to sabotage most of your benefits.
Yeah. So you're basically sitting down and eating the same number of times. You're just adding some more calories, and you're also switching the types of maybe the type and the amount of protein and carbs.
Yeah. Now, and if you're going to eat later, that would be a day to eat later. Now, let me caution you, especially if you have an Oura Ring, and you probably know this already if you do, that on that day that you're strengthening and you're really pushing it, your readiness score is going to go down the next day, maybe by 10 or 20 points, typically 20 points. Yeah. Yeah. So don't be surprised. That's good.
That's fine. That's part of the normal cycling in and out. It's that cycle of catabolism. We never define these terms, but let me just do this. Is this process of breakdown, which is a necessary component of life, and then anabolism is repair and regrowth. So it's this breakdown and cycling between catabolism and anabolism that we're going for in this protocol. So it shouldn't be alarming that you see the readiness score drop, because that's just part of that cycle.
Yeah, and what we're doing with this, as you mentioned right in the beginning, is we're replicating ancestral patterns, which has just essentially been abandoned by the typical diet.
Absolutely. Well, I'm really excited about this strategy. We've actually already started using it in the clinic with patients. And
Yahoo!
having some good results. So we typed up a whole thing and directing them to your book and your cookbook. And then it's pretty close. That's why I was so excited when I saw your book. It's very close to what I was already doing, but I really like how you kind of systematized it, and patients are finding it really easy to follow, and they're getting some, I think, some really good results. So I'm excited about the book. It's called Keto Fast. And then there's also, you mentioned the cookbook. I know, when is Keto Fast out? And then when is the Keto Fast
out? Comes out, I believe, April 30th. And the cookbook will be out shortly after that, within a week or two, I think.
Awesome. Yeah. And the cookbook is super helpful too, because I think this will be a little bit of a new approach for people, and just getting a sense of what they can be eating during these various phases is really helpful.
Well, let me just tell you how delighted I am to hear that with your endorsement for this process, because myself personally and most of our staff have enormous respect for your clinical wisdom and judgment and your ability to articulate these things. And the fact that we sort of paralleled on the same conclusion is just remarkably reaffirming.
Yeah, I love that too. And I'm an early adopter, as I know you are. You're probably the earliest of the early adopters. So I have great appreciation for all the work you've done and the way you've moved the conversation forward over and over again on many of these different topics. So thanks for putting this out there. The book is Keto Fast, and then Keto Fasting Cookbook. Highly recommend it. It's really the best way that I've seen so far of safely and effectively implementing fasting and ketogenic diet and avoiding some of the pretty significant risks and downsides to ongoing ketogenic dieting and water fasting. So definitely check it out. And Joe, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really enjoyed our chat. And what's next for you at this point?
Well, I interestingly listened to a interview that Tim Ferriss did with Peter Drucker, not Peter Drucker, Jim Collins, who wrote the book. Great.
Yep, sure.
Mentor, you probably heard it, but his mentor was Peter Drucker. Yeah. And I was surprised to find out that Peter, who's really one of the icons in the business world, wrote 2/3 of his book after the age of 65.
Ah, interesting.
So that was a real inspiration to me, because I hit 65 this year. So I'm in an affirmation that I really do enjoy writing, and I've got this really good. I've got to share this RSS feed with you, so you can get to PubMed. So I'm reviewing about 2,000 articles a year now, not the abstracts, but the actual articles. Yeah. And so I'm just writing books. My next one is EMF that should be hopefully out either later this year or early next year, and then one on longevity, which is probably 5 books, I think.
Yeah, it's a big topic, that's for sure. Well, great. We'll look forward to the next one, and have a wonderful weekend. Pleasure to talk to you.
All right, thanks.
That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresser L.A.C. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.